Anyone can make a movie. That is what I love about America. In America, anyone can do anything. So long as you don't care what other people say or think about you. And so long as you have lots and lots of money.
What do you think? How do you hope to be remembered?
How does anyone hope to be remembered? As a visionary, as an artist, as a champion, as a lover, as a man, as a father, and a friend. I only hope to be remembered. I don't much care how or why.
As a filmmaker?
Sure.
I mean, how do you hope to be remembered as a filmmaker?
Oh. As a genius.
Do you think your films deserve a place in film history with people like Hitchcock, like Hawks, like Orson Welles, Griffith and Chaplin?
I think yes. I think I did something that a lot of people, as Hawks and Griffiths and Hitchcock, Chaplin, maybe. I think. Do my films deserve a place in film history? I think so, yes.
And why do you think that?
Not a single director in history that I know of, other than Garbo, made more movies. So many movies. For much money and in less time, in the face of such, frankly, aggressive criticism. Such universally negative reception than Garbo.
He was a bad filmmaker, there's no doubt about it. But he was so fearless and so rich that he was able to become one of the most prolific filmmakers of the first half of the 20th century.
He knew what he wanted, my grandfather, and he was bound and determined to get it by any means necessary. And I do mean by any means. He considered himself a true American in that respect. Why do I think my films should be remembered? Why not? That was him. That was my grandfather. My grandfather was born Hans von Wienenschaften-Gubenberg. His father, my great-grandfather, was the Viscount of the Principality of Wienenschaften-Gubenberg, which is in present-day Germany. This is him. He was, by all accounts, a very austere, very cold, very mean man. Terrible man, my great-grandfather was. Terrible father. And he was so ruthless, in fact. Well, you know the story of Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, they called him. He was an Eastern European prince, and he was the inspiration for Dracula, the vampire, because he was so terrible and so cruel to his subjects. Well, my great-grandfather, the Viscount of Wienenschaften-Gubenberg, was so cruel that they called him the vampire of Wienenschaften-Gubenberg. People hated him, his subjects. They were very wealthy, my family, royalty and all. He inherited the title from his father, and Hans, my grandfather, it came to pass, was next in line. My grandfather was born in 1895. He was the 10th, fourth youngest of 13 children. 9 of them died.
Oh my God.
Yes, in 2 separate, if you can believe it, in 2 separate milking accidents. 4 in the first one, and 5,
In the second one?
In the second one, yes. It was in 1901, my grandfather was 6, that 2 men came to his house with this new invention of theirs called the bioscope. They had first demonstrated it in 1895, when film was beginning to take off in a lot of different parts of the world.
I mean, imagine being a 6-year-old. the son of imperial German lower royalty at the beginning of the 20th century. It doesn't get much better than that. And then for these guys to come in and show him, it was a short little film of two men wrestling, but the men in the film, they made a point to demonstrate, weren't really in the room. Like, it was magic. They were only there in this little black and white box on the wall, dancing and moving around in real life. And then, they were gone.
The men were put to death immediately on the charge of practicing sorcery. No trial, just zip, dead, just like that.
And Hans, of course, he could never let his father know about his obsession with film. So he would have servants take him to neighboring cities and towns under the auspices of shopping or random peasant killing, something harmless. But he would secretly go to theaters and fairgrounds and watch all of these groundbreaking early films.
And meanwhile, his father was still executing every photographer or cameraman he could find. Hans was terrified that if his father ever found out, he would execute him too. And he actually was making plans to go to escape, essentially, to the neighboring principality. But then... World War I threw a massive wrench into my grandfather's plans to leave the country. Of course, he wasn't going to fight in it, but he had to remain under close watch at all times.
He would still, every now and again, watch movies, have them brought in and projected in secret, and then destroy them, along with the projectors.
Whenever his father asked him why he needed more money, he would just always say it was for prostitutes and opium, because that was better than watching films.
And he destroyed the films, too. You know, most of the silent films that were ever produced in the early 20th century, over 80% of them, we believe, are lost permanently. Just gone. 10% of that, at least, we think, was Garbo destroying every film he ever watched.
But the most amazing thing about the war for Garbo was it exposed him to some new films from around the world. From France, from Italy, and eventually, towards the end of the war, he started getting films from America.
And film, then, that's what he knew. For him, film wasn't just something he liked watching anymore. It was bigger than that. Celebrities, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, these early sort of auteur, incredible silent filmmakers. These guys were huge. He fell in love with them as much as he did their films. He wanted to be them. And there was only one way he could think to do that.
He didn't just have to get out of the country. He had to get to America. And he didn't just want to watch movies, he wanted to make them.
And in 1919, at the end of the war, the Viscount, Hans's father, was assassinated. Nothing would ever be the same.
After his father was assassinated at the end of the First World War, Garbo inherited the title himself. Of course, given his father's reputation, this wasn't exactly something that he wanted. Add to that the fact that everyone in his family was a target for this group that had assassinated his father, and Hans had to get out of Wienenstadt and Gubenberg. So he took his inheritance money, he took everything, and he left. The first thing he did when he got to America, he sailed into New York, into Ellis Island, and the first thing he did when he got off the boat, well, he was arrested for public urination. That was the very first thing. The rules he was used to, it was a little bit different in America, but as soon as he made bail, the first thing he did was go see a movie.
And the story goes that after he arrived in America, he knew that California was the place to go to make movies, Hollywood. He got on a train to Hollywood, he walked right into a film set. Security, you know, in those days, was a lot more lax than we think of today. You wouldn't even imagine. And he walked right onto a lot that was shooting a film, and he just picked up one of those cone things, you know, very director, very Cecil B. DeMille. And he started streaming into it, streaming orders at people. Didn't speak a word of English, but they knew what they were doing, and he had the cone, so they just went along with it. And he did this for about 2 weeks. Every day, he'd go back to the same studio. Some days, he couldn't remember which one he went to, so he picked a new one. Every day, the cone. And after about 2 weeks, without anyone realizing, he'd made his first film, called Me and My Little La-Di-Da.
He went uncredited as a director, writer, actor, and producer for Me and My Little La-Di-Da, because nobody knew who he was. Heck, He didn't even have a job there.
But one studio, Generic Pictures, he'd been back there a few times, and he started to make friends with some of the people. And eventually, he landed a job there. So in the Hollywood studio system, in the golden age of Hollywood, which started around this time, you had what was called the Big Five. You had 20th Century Fox, you had RKO, Paramount, Warner Brothers, and MGM. Right below that, you had the Little Three, which were Universal, Columbia, and UA, United Artists. Below that, you had what was known as the Poverty Row, your Monograms, your Republics. They made all the B pictures. Generic was about 2 or 3 levels below that.
Hans couldn't have been happier working for Generic. He was a filmmaker.
He did everything. He directed, he acted, he wrote scripts, still spoke no English. He just pieced together what he remembered from all the other American movies he'd seen, which, unfortunately, resulted in some less than perfect dialogue.
Now, the president at the time of Generic was a man named Howard P. Glick. He loved young, up-and-coming, lesser-known directors. He loved giving people opportunities. He hired a lot of immigrants, a lot of people from Eastern Europe. And he loved risk-takers and foreigners. And Glick, well, every studio has a style. Universal had their big monster movies. Paramount had high production value period pieces, things like that. Warner Brothers did a lot of softcore pornography at that time. But Glick had a flair for, let's call it, the suburban.
Lawn games. He called them pastime pictures. The 1920s, it's a little known fact because of all the gambling and drinking and partying that went on, but the 1920s also saw a massive, massive boom in the popularity of these hobbies like lawn games, badminton, bocce ball, darts, things like that.
And in a way, Glick's ideas were responding quite appropriately to the cultural milieu. But the results? Well, it didn't make for very good drama. At best, they were pretty boring. And at worst, well, they were downright inappropriate.
But in 1924, after 4 years at Generic, Garbo was still having trouble finding success.
He was still going by his real name. It was part of the problem. He had a hard enough times as Hans, given the anti-German sentiment in the United States after World War I, but nobody could even say von Wienenschaften-Gubenberg. I mean, they literally couldn't pronounce it. It barely fit on the posters.
This is a review from a local paper of one of his earlier films with Generic. This is from 1921. When Mr. Von W., they didn't use his full name, when Mr. Von W. is able to put aside his foolish pride and muster up the gumption to shorten his oppressively lengthy surname into something better suited to the American tongue, then perhaps we at the Herald Inquirer will be able to put aside our better judgment in watching past the first 30 seconds of his latest film, Dial C for Croquet. Judging from his previous work with Generic, we suspect the task will be an onerous one.
Glick wasn't very happy with Hans's performance. He liked Hans, but he was a businessman before anything.
And he looked around one day in 1924, and he thought, what would a real American do in this situation? And he said, why not just start over? Why not just do my own thing?
Deciding on his new name, believe it or not, was actually the hardest part for him.
He wanted something iconically American. And he had always admired Greta Garbo, the actress, who was just starting to get big at this time. He'd seen all her films.
But the first thing he realized was that Hollywood was pretty much tapped out in terms of studios. He couldn't have bought the property if he wanted to.
He still wanted to be relatively close to the industry and the actors, and there was a little town just a few hours east in Nevada with nothing but an old abandoned Mormon fort and some Native American curses on it called Las Vegas.
And in late 1924, Garbo Studios opened its doors. At the time, while it was under construction, Hans basically became the largest employer in Las Vegas. They put up a plaque with his name on it, created over 1,000 jobs with the construction of this massive studio. Of course, once it was finished, he sent all these men packing, and the city took a massive hit economically.
Some people think he set the urban growth of Las Vegas back 20 years at least.
They took the plaque down.
So this is it. This is the original Garbo Studios building. Now, because of my grandfather's reputation in Las Vegas, not a lot of efforts have been made to preserve it or restore it. But this is, for the most part, structurally, that is, the original 1924 building.
And how long was he here? I mean, how long was he making movies here?
Oh, his whole life. His entire career. 1959, I think, was the last film they made here. Over here, you had the dressing rooms for the actors and the actresses. This was where they sewed the costumes, made all the props. The scene shop back here, they built all the sets. Like I said, not a lot of preservation efforts yet underway. Come over here, I'll show you the sound stage. Massive. He had one of the biggest sound stages in film at the time. Bigger than most Hollywood studios. In fact, bigger than the back lot of a lot of Hollywood studios. There it is. And now, over here, this is a very interesting story. Now, this was my grandfather's personal office. And there's a story that in the 1930s, when sound film was just coming around, a couple of microphone operators went back here. Oh, God. I think there were two homeless men having sex over there in that corner. I didn't get a good look, so I can't say for sure, but one of them might have been an animal. I don't know.
Oh my God.
Anyway, Jesus Christ, that was wild. Anyway, moving on. Oh boy.
Are you all right?
Yeah, fine. Sorry.
You sure?
Yeah. Yeah, fine. I think I just need some fresh air.
Wait, what's that?
Oh, this is, is this? This might not be his studio. Yeah, actually, I remember now. This is not my grandfather's studio.
What?
I think it burnt down. His original studio, I think it burnt down multiple times, actually. Or rather, it was burnt down by some disgruntled former employees. Not maliciously, mind you. They burnt it down so they could get paid to rebuild it again. Yeah, I have no idea what this place is.
Hey, you boys looking for a good time?
Oh my God, Jesus Christ, go, run, we gotta head here.
So he starts this studio, all by himself, doesn't know a thing about running a business, let alone a film studio, doesn't know anyone in town. But he's a new man with a new name.
Of course, the name change only went so far. The people who he'd worked with generic knew who he was, and he was essentially mocked, laughed at for trying to go off and start this studio. They called him Hans of Iceland, which is a very obscure reference to a relatively unknown 19th century Victor Hugo novel that someone knew Hans was a fan of. It was more popular in the early 20th century, and it doesn't seem that bad, but if you've read the novel, it's an absolutely cruel nickname.
They called him other things too. To his face, behind his back, Hans Garbage.
Hans Barfo.
Weenie Gooberberg.
Cecil B. DeKraut.
Hans which wasn't clever at all, but still hurt.
Hans Dildo.
Wad.
But someone, somehow, managed to figure out a little bit about Hans's upbringing, and about who his father was, and about his father's reputation, and his father's nicknames, which gave rise to what became one of the most famous insults he ever received.
Vampire of Vegas.
The Vampire of Vegas.
The Vampire of Vegas. The fact that he essentially single-handedly built and crippled the labor force of the entire city of Las Vegas, really within a single year. A lot of people thought that the name was fitting.
And this was a major, major blow for him at first, because he'd spent so much time and energy trying to get away from his former life, to get away from his past and from his reputation. But at the same time, he adored the attention. People were talking about him, and that made him very happy.
For a brief period of time, he had business cards made with the name on it.
Now imagine, you're a 30-year-old Wienenschaften-Gubenberger expat with nothing but the clothes on your back and an almost comically large sum of inheritance money. And you're walking down the street in a pre-gambling Las Vegas, which was a very nasty town before 1931, and who do you run into but the love of your life?
If that's not the American dream, I don't know what is.
Zelda Duguay was everything to Garbo.
There's some debate among scholars of film and Hollywood and of Garbo's life and the history of Las Vegas at this time about Zelda's current occupation when she met Hans Garbo. Some not unreliable contemporary sources seem to suggest that the two met in what was then the red light district of the city. Some think that she may have been supporting herself because the situation for a girl like her at the time in this place with very limited skills and barely the most basic education, you have to understand, it was very, very... The opportunities were quite limited. You did what you had to do to survive, you know? But some signs point to the idea that Zelda was making her way as a working girl of sorts. A lady of the evening, a courtesan, if you will.
Oh yeah, Zelda was a hooker. No doubt about it.
My grandfather took one look at this destitute girl and he said, "This is how I will be a real American hero. I'm going to rescue you from your moral depravity." He actually said that out loud, according to Zelda's biography.
And the first film that Garbo made with Duguay. One of the first big productions at Garbo Studios, and really the film that put Garbo Studios on the map as one of the most productive, most excessive, worst quality film houses out there, was The Finer Things.
It was one of the highest budget films in Hollywood to date. Still, if you look at some of the list of the most expensive films ever made, even without adjusting for inflation, The Finer Things is still up there. 7, 8 on the list, 9? I don't know. Avatar really screwed things up.
Part of it was just an excuse to shower Zelda with gifts, to make her fall in love with him. There's a necklace in the film, and the film is basically about this courtship between the two of them, but at a certain point in the film, Hans's character, Paul, presents Zelda's character, Evelyn, with this massive diamond necklace. And my grandfather insisted that all the diamonds be real diamonds. He said that nothing else would catch the light like the real thing.
He paid $4 million for that one shot. You never see the necklace again. Not once. In the whole movie. And now we enter the golden age of Garbo Studios. The late 1920s and all of the 30s were the most productive period, not just of his life, but honestly, of any filmmaker's life that we know of.
He may or may not have insinuated that he was in some way related to Greta Garbo in order to market his pictures to the bigger theaters.
It didn't quite work as a marketing strategy, but believe it or not, the lawsuit that came out of the Garbo name incident really helped to boost Garbo Studios.
Mr. Garbo, is your real name Hans von Wien? Oh, how the hell do they expect me to say this?
Von Wienenschaften-Gubenberg.
Yes, that's it.
No, I've never heard of it.
But you just said it.
Said what?
Von Wienen... What is it?
Von Wienenschaften-Gubenberg.
Yes, that. See, you knew exactly what I was talking about. You mean to tell me that your given name, the name given to you at birth, isn't Hans von...
Hans von Wienenschaften-Gubenberg. No, it isn't. I've never even heard that name before.
Sir, may I remind you that you are under oath?
Is Greta here? I'd like to speak to my sister. Meanwhile, he was still using his films, most of his films, as an excuse to court Zelda gay and make her fall in love with him. And it worked!
In 1928, he married Zelda gay. She was 19 and he was 33, but it was a different time.
It was the happiest day of his life.
In 1932, they had their first child, Hans Garbo Jr. At this point, he legally changed his name to Garbo. They had 2 more children, one in 36, Charles Chaplin Garbo.
And another in 1938, Buster Keaton Garbo. One of the things that Garbo learned very quickly in the earliest days of his studio was how hard it was to make films by yourself, even in the 1920s. So in 1927, he hires a man by the name of Greg Piffle, who would serve as his assistant on almost all of his films.
The story of how Garbo and Piffle met is one of the more bizarre, meet-cute stories in film history. Hans knew Greg from his time at Generic. They had never spoken, he just knew of him. And Greg Piffle was sort of a wonderkin there at Generic. He worked on almost every picture they did. He was a young guy, but he did it all. Lights, sound, camera, he'd run and get your coffee if you needed him to, and the story goes, of course none of this is substantiated, it's all just Hollywood urban legend, but they say that Hans snuck onto the Generic lot with a potato sack and, well, dragged Greg Piffle into his car and drove off.
There's some debate about Greg Piffle's willingness to work for my father, whether he was coerced or, what is it, compensated for his labor.
But it was a good thing that Greg decided to go with Hans when he did, because a year later, in 1928, Generic Pictures went under. And a year after that, the Great Depression hit.
Believe it or not, the Great Depression actually reinvigorated the film industry in the United States. Movies were somewhere where pretty much anybody could afford to go, every now and again at least, to escape, to get away from it all.
Sound film was just starting to get big in the early 1930s, and Garbo made the transition a little begrudgingly, because he still had no formal education in English. But he was excited about the audiences that the Depression brought in as much as anyone, and he knew that sound was the only way he could stay ahead of the game. He could afford it. Unfortunately, his first sound film was a little deaf, no pun intended, to the needs of these Depression audiences.
The film was called To Be Rich, and it was definitely out of touch with the American people.
Say, Rutherford, wouldn't it suck to be poor? The piss, Billingsley.
Unemployment, when that film was released, was at 30%. Now, we couldn't talk about Hans Garbo's career as a filmmaker without talking about a man named Edward Littlepage.
Ed Littlepage was a freelance critic, one of the most preeminent critics in the B to C- film world in the early 20s and 30s. He wrote for all the big publications that talked about lesser known and less successful films and studios.
Nobody in the press was harder on Garbo's films than Littlepage. I mean it when I say that over 15 years of reporting, Ed Littlepage never had a single nice word to say about Garbo or any of his films. Not one. Except...
The only solace I find, not just in this film, but across Mr. Garbo's entire corpus, is in the conviction that the man himself is so clearly clueless as a filmmaker, so utterly vacuous as an artist, and so completely effete as a human being, so as to be universally reviled by history if he is not altogether forgotten.
That was written in the Ladies' Home Journal, so you can see that he didn't really pull any punches.
And then he died.
Garbo?
No, Littlepage. It was very sudden. He was very young, in his 40s. Suicide, if I remember.
Well, Garbo was thrilled. This was the answer to all of his problems, all the criticism. He couldn't ask for a better turn of good fortune.
What?
Is there anybody who thinks that Garbo may have had a hand in Littlepage's death? It seems pretty convenient if he hated him so much and he was ruining his career for him to just go off and commit suicide.
Well, there are some cynics out there to be sure, but the evidence that exists doesn't exactly lean one way or another.
My grandfather was a lot of things, but he wasn't a murderer.
Oh, yeah. Garbo almost certainly murdered Ed Littlepage.
All the evidence points to him, and the whole system at the time was very different.
He all but signed his name to the murder. I mean, Ed Littlepage left a suicide note that was essentially just an apology letter for all the mean things he ever said about Garbo's films. He took it all back. Ed Littlepage, he called him... What did he call him again?
The greatest visionary of his or any previous generation, yeah.
Right. And he said it in very broken English. I mean, the spelling was atrocious. It was pretty clearly Garbo's own handwriting, but that's how the Las Vegas police force, really the entire United States legal system, was run in the 1920s and 30s.
It's a damn shame.
By the 1940s, Garbo was still finding it hard to fully transition to sound. He'd still never bothered to learn English, and these simple silent films he was used to making, they just wouldn't cut it anymore.
And there just wasn't as much demand for cinema like there was in the early 20th century. It wasn't like it used to be in the early days. People just were fascinated by movies in general. You could film a man eating oatmeal for 10 minutes, and people would still buy tickets, which Hans did in one of his earlier films at Garbo Studios, Breakfast of Oatmeal.
So can we talk about The Last King of the Aztecs?
I don't think we're legally allowed to talk about that.
I don't want to talk about that.
No, we can't talk about that. No. No, we can't talk about that. No!
No, I can't.
The Last King of the Aztecs was released in 1944. Garbo somehow considered it a response to Citizen Kane.
He apparently thought it was artistic.
Before it was released, Last King of the Aztecs was banned in over 40 states. And they hadn't even seen it yet. That was just from the poster that they sent out to the theaters to hang up. Before it was released. Banned in 40 states because of the poster.
I mean, you have to understand, this was the 1940s. You could get away with a heck of a lot on camera at this time, yet he still managed to offend everyone.
He received death threats, threats of violence.
According to some accounts, people who were at the world premiere in New York actually threw up in the middle of the screening.
A man himself. Literally his pants. He was so disturbed.
They couldn't even stop the film because the projectionist flung himself out of the booth. Some people think he was trying to kill himself. Every print of the film is mostly destroyed. We can show you the only parts of the film that weren't banned in some part of the world or another. That's it. That's everything that nobody had a problem with. The original film was 4 hours.
And that, I mean, normally this would be a career-ending film. I mean, it was almost a life-ending film. But Garbo didn't care. He still had more money. It didn't matter. The money never mattered. But he was about to get a major wake-up call in his personal life. Zelda, for almost 10 years, had been having an affair with Greg Piffle, Garbo's assistant and his right-hand man, and Garbo, of course, was devastated. Their marriage had never been perfect, but he still loved her. So you can imagine how upset he was when, shortly after the news of the affair broke, both Zelda DeGay and Greg Piffle died. Double suicide.
Oh my god.
Yes, it was absolutely tragic.
And they left just one suicide note between the two of them, which was strange, in which they apologized for all the sadness and trouble that they ever caused Garbo. Oddly enough, there was a line copied almost exactly from Ed Littlepage's suicide note, where they called him the greatest visionary of his or any previous generation. And it's led some people to think that there might have been some foul play on Garbo's part.
He did an interview with blood on his hands. Literally, there was blood on his hands. It was like he killed them and went straight to the interview.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sure you've heard the news of my wife, Zelda, and my assistant were both killed. Died.
What? What? No. Oh my god, I'm so sorry.
No, I think they're dead. So I've heard. I wouldn't know anything about that.
What? Are they dead? Do you know?
No, I don't know. Do you know?
You just said that they were dead. You said that.
Oh my god, they're dead? Oh my god.
The next year, he made a series of very dark, very personal, very painful films. Probably some of the most profound work he'd ever done. You had The Tryst, about a man who discovers that his wife is having an affair and kills her and her lover. You had To Love and Have Lost, which in a similar vein is about a woman who cheats on her husband and he kills her. And finally, probably one of his best known films from this period, I Killed My Wife, in which the main character kills his wife.
Finally, in 1954, this book comes out, a novel called The Splendor of the Night. It's by a relatively unknown author at the time, Elizabeth Smollett Hupp, or E.S. Hupp, and it fared not terribly in reviews. People read it, but it wasn't at the top of any bestseller lists.
He knew he had to turn it into a movie.
Garbo offered Elizabeth Smollett Hupp $2 million for the rights. $2 million. To give you an idea, in 1936, when MGM bought the rights to Gone with the Wind, they paid $50,000. Granted, it was in 1936, but it was Gone with the Wind. $2 million.
There was some speculation that, because if you can believe it, after almost 35 years in the United States and 35 years in the industry, he still spoke very little English. So there's some speculation that my grandfather didn't know the difference between the word night, like when it's dark, and knight with a K, like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
So when he went to write the screenplay, everywhere in the novel that used the word night, he thought it meant the other night. So the script, it makes very little sense. He wrote half of the first draft of the screenplay in the span of about 5 hours, in the middle of the night, one night in 1954. He picked it back up in 1957 and wrote the word lunch pail. And that became an actual line in the movie and made it in the final cut. One of the characters just says lunch pail out of nowhere. He didn't touch it for about a year, and finally, in 1958, he finished the script in about a week.
The first draft was 473 pages long, so almost a full 100 pages longer than the novel that it was based on. So he wrote a second draft later in 1958 that was even longer at 511 pages.
Finally, he just said we have to get this thing into production, and he chopped off everything after 120 pages. No revisions, no editing, nothing. So the version that we have of The Splendor of the Night is really only the first quarter or so of what would have been a roughly 10-hour movie had Garbo produced the entire original script.
And if the pre-production process was, let's say, stressful, the actual production is when the you-know-what really hit the fan.
The casting alone took almost another year. Zelda and Greg Piffle, his two most trusted actors, were gone.
He was always the star, obviously.
But it was strange, because in the beginning it was fine when he would star in all these films, because he wasn't an unattractive man playing these sort of suave, Douglas Fairbanks type debonair male leads. It was fine. Now, he's 65 years old.
They eventually found to play the part of the female lead a young actress whose given name was Laura Hickox. She thought that didn't sound Hollywood enough, so she was going by Eloise Van Horn. And Garbo thought that even that didn't sound Hollywood enough, so he made her change her name again to Imogen Hyde Foster. And then about halfway through production, Garbo changed his mind. He thought the name sounded almost too Hollywood, more Hollywood than his, so he made her change it again to Dolores Simpson.
Plus a small army of extras. Literally, he went down to Central America where the labor was cheaper and hired the entire army of a small country called Palomba. The president, at the time of Palomba, threatened to go to war with the United States if Hans didn't comply. But of course it was a hollow threat. Hans had their army.
And the country, Palomba, doesn't exist anymore. It was invaded shortly after he hired the army, and it was taken over.
The Palumbo episode was one of the darker periods in the history of United States international relations. Some people claim that technically the United States was single-handedly responsible for the collapse of the entire country and the disintegration of the government. But Mr. Garbo at the time technically was not a US citizen, so whose fault it is, the responsibility is a bit of a gray area. Still terrible though that it happened.
The production, like any Hollywood production, was fraught with setbacks and challenges.
Every day he would add more and more to the script. New pages during production, every day new lines. A lot of times he would just improvise on camera and nobody would know what he was doing.
Towards the end of production, when they just needed to get things finished, he called it a dormitory, but it was essentially a shelter built in the studio. And he forced the crew and the actors to live there for 2 weeks, in conditions basically like a prison. They had cots, they had blankets, and not a lot else. There's some question about whether or not the way Garbo treated his employees was considered kidnapping or reckless endangerment. It was definitely one of them.
According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, what Hans did was a war crime.
But they finished the movie. Only took them 4 more years.
And just before the film was about to be released, in 1963, he sends Elizabeth Smollett Hupp, the author, a cut of the film. And she'd almost completely forgotten the thing even existed, or that she'd sold the rights. She figured the movie was never getting made because she hadn't heard anything about it.
She tried to stop the film from being made. She tried to sue him. She attacked him in the press, saying that the version of the film he made was not her book, which, of course, she was right.
And then, just as the film was about to be released, about a week before the release date, she passed away. Suicide. She left a note saying that the version of the film she saw was better than anything she could have ever imagined. Not just that it was an amazing adaptation of her book, but one of the best movies she'd ever seen. And she said that Hans was the greatest visionary of his or any previous generation, or something like that. It was quite tragic.
Just an eerie coincidence.
And then finally, with Elizabeth Smollett Hupp's complete and total posthumous support, after almost 10 years of work on one project, millions and millions of dollars poured into it, he releases the film, finally, in 1963.
And they hated it. The critics, audiences, everyone hated it.
Oh, it was a terrible film. Terrible. What did you expect? He was a terrible filmmaker.
And after a career of making some of the most hated movies in all of Hollywood, this, for some reason, was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Cut to 1966. Hans had landed a few odd jobs in the industry, most notably doing the voiceover for Werther's Originals ads.
Okay, one more time. Repeat after me. Werther's.
Verzers.
Werther's.
Verzers.
All you have to do is say the name!
I'm saying it's a Verzers.
It's literally the name of the product!
And a print of The Splendor of the Night finds its way onto a little college campus in upstate New York. And this group of kids get their hands on it, and they watch it, and they send Hans a letter. It's the funniest thing they've ever seen.
Of course, Hans never intended it to be a comedy, but these kids didn't know that. How could they? It was god-awful.
And pretty soon they found more and more of his films, every one that was out there that they could get their hands on. They loved all of them.
Most of what we know today about Garbo as a filmmaker came out around this time. And who knows, if those kids in upstate New York had never found those movies, we might not be talking about this today.
And for Garbo, fame was fame. Celebrity was celebrity. That's how he always saw it.
They would have screenings of a lot of his movies, but especially The Splendor of the Night. He would go to them all across the country. He would travel as many as he could go to. People would lose their minds.
He had everything he'd ever wanted. He got the fame. He got the recognition. He got love. People loved his movies, and then he got syphilis.
Well, he'd always had the syphilis. It was just a matter of diagnosing it, which they did in 1972.
So much syphilis. His wife was a prostitute.
He died in 1973.
When Hans died in 1973, Hundreds of people showed up to his funeral in Las Vegas.
He was so loved. His movies were so bad.
This is it. This is his final resting place where Hans Garbo was buried in 1973. It's probably a little more unassuming than you'd expect. Back when he had first come to America, and he was still concerned that the people who had assassinated his father were going to be coming after him, Garbo actually drew up plans for his burial and how he wanted things to look like. He had this very elaborate mausoleum. These pillars and these massive columns with Corinthian capitals, all marble, plus just a huge mess of other architectural features. The plans actually went on to become the basis for the Cheesecake Factory chain of restaurants, if you're familiar with those.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Well, at the end of the day, he had spent so much money on creating the splendor of the night that he really just didn't have enough left for a very elaborate burial, and there weren't any really, any close friends or family members who would be willing to pay for a mausoleum. The one thing he did have, that he had always wanted, was the mysterious quote that appeared in every suicide note of all the people Garbo had ever known who had died. Here lies Hans Garbo, the greatest visionary of his or any previous generation. And in the early days, shortly after his death, fans would come and they would leave trinkets by the grave. Copies of Splendor of the Night, or badminton rackets and shuttlecocks, like symbols of his early days at Generic, but some people defaced the grave. People who had seen the original prints for The Last King of the Aztecs. I think this is actually the third or fourth gravestone they're on by now, but that's it. That's the story of Hans Garbo.
How do you hope to be remembered?
Hans Garbo was nothing if not passionate and rich. He was so rich.
He changed the way movies were made. There's no doubt about it. Nobody at the time could match him for his frivolous spending, his mistreatment of his employees, and for just making terrible, terrible movies.
He was ahead of his time.
I think the greatest story he ever told was his life.
He was a man who wanted to be a god. But instead, he became a fallen angel. But sometimes the fallen angels...
What?
I don't know. It was better in my head. Put it at the end. It sounds inspirational.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Garbo. This has been Hans Garbo, ladies and gentlemen, director of The Splendor of the Night, an adaptation of the late Elizabeth Smollett Hupp's novel. And many, many more films.
Yes, thank you. So we start the interview now?
We just finished.
Finished what?
The interview, Mr. Garbo. That was the interview we just had.
Just now.
Oh. Well, when can I see it?
It just happened. It's over. You can't see it. You participated in it.
Oh. Did I sound smart?
No.